Okay. I think there'll be a couple more people joining us from Northumbria because I've just noticed more people have joined the Teams meeting there. We'll have a couple more joining. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We're very lucky to have Richard Dunstan with us from Maternity Action, and he's going to be talking to us. Well, you've seen the blurb, but effectively talking to us about campaigning around legal and policy reform. So Richard is a public affairs officer at Maternity Action, which is a small charity offering free legal advice to pregnant women and new parents on their workplace rights and relevant social security benefits, and on access to healthcare as well. And it's based on evidence from that advice work that Maternity Action campaigned for that legal policy reform. Prior to working for Maternity Action in 2019, Richard worked as an aide to Caroline Lucas MP for the Green Party for 4 years. And prior to that, as a policy analyst at Working Families, Citizens Advice, and the National Audit Office, the Law Society, and for a significant period of time at Amnesty International UK as well. So Richard is a preeminent policy expert, someone that we can learn a lot from. And just a brief kind of overview of Maternity Action as well. They do work at give lots of advice for pregnant women and new parents, and 4 kind of advice services. So looking at maternity rights advice service in terms of telephone and email advice, in terms of employment rights, maternity pay benefits, etc. They also do employment casework services, and that's free legal casework. They do maternity care access advice service as well, and also the Migrant Women's Rights Service. So a real great service that they offer through Maternity Action, and something that I encourage you to look into if you haven't already done so. And their website was on the email invite. But if you have any questions, they're very easy to find on Google search. So I will pass you over at this point to Richard. He's got to talk to us a bit about their kind of campaign areas, and then we're going to have an open discussion as well. If you have any questions, you have an option to either use the chat function, or if you want to just put your hand up, if it's a point of clarification, Richard's very happy just to take a quick point of clarification during his talk as well. But yeah, please use the chat if it's something you want to wait until the end, and we can field those questions together as kind of questions at the end. All right, so at that point, I'll go quiet and let Richard take over.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone, and many thanks to Matt for the invitation to join you today, and for that very delicate way of saying how old I am in an introduction. I'm going to talk today about specifically about reform of the existing shared parental leave scheme and our proposed model for a new system of maternity and parental leave based on individual rights for each parent. I'm not going to talk at great length, and I tend to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, but as Mark says, if you've got if something I said isn't clear, please jump in by raising your hand or messaging Mark. As some of you will remember, because I recognize some of the names across the top of the screen, I attended your recent discussion of this issue with Jeremy from the Fatherhood Institute. And I think the best place for me to start today is to repeat what I said at the very end of that discussion briefly, which was that while Maternity Action clearly comes at this issue from a different perspective to the Fatherhood Institute, the majority of those who call our helplines and use our casework services are pregnant women and new mothers, we are very much on the same page in believing that more equal parenting is a very good thing, that we need to see a lot more of it, and that the current legal provisions are failing parents and will continue to do so without major reform. So I'm not going to repeat the case that Jeremy made so well for better rights to parental leave for fathers. I think it's fair to say that there really is no debate that more equal parenting is good for fathers and for mothers. It's good for sex equality in the home and in the workplace, and is good for the economy and society more generally. So I'm going to start by looking at just how badly the existing provisions are working. So I'm going to share my screen and put up a slide now. Mark, I think you might need to allow me to share my screen, sorry.
Oh, yes. Yeah, look. 1 minute. I'll just make you host. That's probably the best option.
Okay. Fine.
Has that worked now? The other option is to just quickly email me and I can share the screen. Apologies, everyone. This is my brilliant idea to have me as the host so that I could let people in. And now, obviously, coming to gremlins. Have you got the share screen option, Richard, there, or is it?
Having to change my privacy settings.
In the meantime, if anyone has any questions, oh, here we go. Great.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay. So this chart, which I hope everyone can see, shows take-up of shared parental leave since the scheme came into force 6 years ago amongst eligible fathers. And as you can see, and I should point out that the vertical axis only goes to 25%. I know that's not best practice, but if you take it to 100%, you end up with a lot of empty space. So this is take up amongst the estimated 285,000 eligible fathers each year. But there's a couple of things I should say about these figures. First is these are not actual take-up figures because there are no published take-up figures. These are my best estimate from the data that is published by the government, which relates solely to not to leave taken, but to shared parental pay. And there are some problems with that data because it includes both mothers and fathers. And there is also a great deal of double counting. So these are best estimates. So they're not strictly accurate, but I don't think the reality is very different to these figures. And we can see that this is a really, really low level, completely short of what was predicted. In 2013, the government rather unambitiously predicted a take-up rate between 2 and 8%. As you can see, we haven't even reached the halfway stage of that. But in November 2017, the then minister told MPs that the government was looking at a success rate of at least 25%. You can see we're well short of that. Now, a few weeks ago, the BBC Radio 4 programme, You and Yours, made the mistake of thinking that this dire rate of take-up reflects a lack of demand on the part of fathers. And yet there's ample evidence, including recent research by both the Fatherhood Institute and the Fawcett Society, that fathers want to be more involved in parenting. And this is a really key point, I think, that needs to be stressed, that the shared parental leave scheme has not failed because of any lack of demand on the part of fathers and their families. It's failed because of its inherent design flaws and its complexity and the ludicrously low rate of pay. Even the name shared parental leave is faulty because what it really is transferable maternity leave. The scheme created no additional leave entitlement for fathers, but simply enabled mothers to transfer all but 2 weeks of their leave to the father or other co-parent. And this means that if the mother, not unreasonably perhaps, wants to use most or all of her maternity leave entitlement to recover from pregnancy and childbirth, there's little or no paid leave left available to the father or the other second parent. And yet the designers of the scheme knew from the government's own research that the average number of weeks of statutory maternity leave taken by mothers is 39 weeks, essentially the full paid entitlement. And 45% of mothers take more than 39 weeks of maternity leave, which means they're taking some unpaid leave. In short, the existing shared parental leave scheme relies on robbing Petra to pay Paul, and we cannot expect much more from it in terms of take-up. It's a dud policy and we need to scrap it. But of course that leaves us with the question, what should replace it? Now, in coming up with the model I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, in 2019, we started with some basic principles. Firstly, the system must consist of individual, non-transferable, that is use it or lose it rights for each parent. There should be no sharing or transferring of leave because we know that does not work well, hasn't worked here, doesn't work well in other countries. Secondly, the system must significantly enhance the paid leave entitlement of fathers and other second parents. That's the whole point of reform, while at the same time protecting the existing rights of mothers to 52 weeks of leave, including 39 weeks of paid leave. Because, as I've said, we know that on average, new mothers take 39 weeks of maternity leave and many take more than that. And this is hardly surprising as contrary to the impression often given by ministers, the duration of paid leave available to new mothers in the UK is short by international standards. That's my next chart. You can see this data is from the OECD. You can see the UK off to the left there with 39 weeks of paid leave. This is paid maternity or parental leave. In some other countries, mothers get a mixture of what is called maternity leave and leave that's called parental leave. Here it's all maternity leave, obviously. And you can see the OECD average there in green and the EU average, well, I think that included the UK, in blue towards the center or towards the right. It's often said in this debate that the UK system is unbalanced, and it is. I'm just going to click ahead to this slide. That's the existing system: 39 weeks of paid leave for mothers, 13 weeks of unpaid leave, and just 2 weeks for fathers. And it's horribly unbalanced. But that doesn't mean that mothers have too much. By international standards, mothers still in the UK don't have that much. What is missing is the leave for fathers. So let's go back to that. So, and related to that point, our third principle is that the structure of the new system should reflect the very different purposes of maternity, paternity, and parental leave, because mothers and fathers' experience of childbirth are not the same. Unlike fathers, and I'm clearly speaking generally, mothers need paid leave to recover from the often severe physical and mental impacts of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding, and fathers do not. As one MP put it recently, for far too many women, pregnancy and childbirth can be complicated and dangerous. So in short, maternity leave is primarily a vital health and safety measure. It's not primarily about caring for the new child. So it's hardly surprising that even in those countries that are lauded for their progressive and equitable approach to parental leave, mothers still take considerably more maternity and parental leave than fathers in the first year after the birth. In Sweden, for example, mothers take an average of 334 days of leave, while fathers take only 131 days. And in Finland, mothers take an average of 260 days of leave, while fathers take only 31 days. And similarly, in the UK, the experience of the small but growing number of companies offering equal amounts of parental leave on full pay to each parent. You would have seen John Lewis joined that rather elite club a couple of weeks ago. And their experience is that mothers continue to take a much longer period of post-birth leave than fathers do. At the insurance firm Aviva, for example, where each parent gets 26 weeks of parental leave on full pay, mothers take an average of 44 weeks off, while fathers take an average of 24 weeks off, not even their full entitlement of 26 weeks. But this is, as I say, entirely to be expected, because new mothers are not just caring for or bonding with their baby, they're recovering from the physical and mental impact of pregnancy and birth. Similarly, paternity leave is a health and safety measure aimed primarily at enabling the father or other second parent to support the mother at and immediately after the time of birth. Parental leave, however, is about parenting, and the ultimate goal of policy reform is more equal parenting over the life of the child, not just or necessarily in the first 12 or 18 months after the birth. There's overwhelming evidence that fathers being involved in parenting early in the life of the child leads to greater involvement over the coming years, and that's what we really want. Accordingly, the new system needs to provide fathers and other second parents with a substantial entitlement to pay parental leave. We're not talking about another week or two. And they need to be able to use that leave at a time or times, if taken in chunks, of their choosing in the months following the child's birth. The fourth of our principles is that these new rights must be available to all working parents, regardless of their employment status. That includes the self-employed, from day one of their employment. And they must be accompanied by a strengthened right to return to the same job at the end of any period of leave. And lastly, but not leastly, the current ludicrously low basic rate of statutory pay, just £152 per week, that's equivalent to less than half of a week on the working full-time on the minimum wage, has to be substantially increased. We've suggested that at the very least, it needs to be doubled. In fact, it's a little bit more than doubled to parity with the minimum wage. But in the longer run, it needs to go higher still to parity with the real living wage and perhaps to close to replacement levels. But of course, that's costly, and that's an issue I'm going to return to in just a minute. And those are our principles. In addition to those, there are some highly desirables, which is that the system should be as simple as possible. It should provide sound foundations for future building so that we can enhance it. We're not just stuck with whatever we introduce now, and it needs to be realistic rather than utopian in terms of the initial cost. And when we got to apply these principles, we found that there are actually not that many options. So as much as I'd like you to believe that we at Maternity Action are policy geniuses, our proposed model is not the policy equivalent of rocket science. So I'm going to move on a slide, and here is our model. There's the existing provisions, just the meager 2 weeks for fathers, and this is what we're proposing. So the blue is paid maternity leave for mothers. The green is paid parental leave for each parent, and the 2 weeks of paternity, the existing 2 weeks of paternity leave here is there in orange. And you can see immediately why we've called this a 6+6+6 model. The blue maternity leave for mothers would be reserved for the mother on a use it or lose it basis, so she takes as much of that as she needs or once. And the parental leave, again, use it or lose it. Each parent has up to 26 weeks paid leave. If they don't use it, it's gone. And I mentioned already that the parental leave, we would hope would be taken as, can be taken as flexibly as possible. So you might take it all in one go, or take it in chunks and perhaps mix up who's at home and who's at work. But together, that would give the two parents between them 18 months of paid time off from work following the birth, which is twice as much as now. It would give mothers 52 weeks in total of pay, which is 13 weeks more than now, and closer to the OECD and EU averages of 54 weeks and 66 weeks respectively. And it would give fathers and other second parents a total paid leave entitlement of up to 28 weeks, which is 26 weeks more than now. The model is relatively simple. It provides the foundations for future enhancement that would, in the long term, would close the gap between the entitlement for mothers and fathers. So, for example, in the future, the paid parental leave could be extended from 6 months for each parent to 9 months to each parent, but the maternity leave would stay at 6. So the overall gap would close from 6 months to 3 months. And in the long run, you could go on adding to the scheme like that. In terms of cost, well, it is quite ambitious, and I'll come to that point in a minute. It is realistic. The current spend on maternity, paternity, and shared parental pay is £2.6 billion per year. We are stuck with a problem that the level of basic pay, £152 a week, is very, very low, which means doing anything about that is going to cost a lot. But we can't pay fathers more than we pay mothers. So if we want to raise pay for fathers, and we know that we need to do that to increase take-up, then we have to raise it for everyone, and that is costly. Just raising the basic rate of pay to the minimum wage would cost an extra £2.7 billion per year, while 6 months of parental leave for fathers paid at the new rate would cost another £1.2 billion. That assumes a 50% take-up, which is maybe optimistic, by eligible fathers, each taking 4 months of leave on average. So these are not insignificant sums. We're talking about £5-6 billion a year extra by the time we've added everything in. And to put that in context, £6 billion is equivalent to 1 penny on the basic rate of income tax. So while there's inevitably a very strong argument for raising the pay much higher, that's probably got to be a sort of long-term goal that happens over a long period of time, but we need to make a start. And the first thing we need to do is create the new structure. And that's our model. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Richard. I have had some familiarity with this, and it's great to see it in this format as well. Helps to further clarify the differences, and again, the shockingly poor maternity leave, even in comparison to other countries in the EU around the world. So that's really, really, really helpful just to see those really helpful illustrations of that. And I fully endorse the 6+6 model. I think it's a really excellent way forward, and the simplicity that's coming through already in some of the comments. People are mentioning how the shared parental leave system is just so complicated, and I know I've spoken to people who have legal backgrounds and even then find it incredibly complicated to unpick the shared parental leave policy and how that works for them and their circumstances. So now I think there's plenty to discuss here. Does anyone want to put their hand up and make a comment, anything that they have thought about or or even share their experiences of shared parental leave. That might be quite interesting to hear about as well. I know from my perspective, it's something that we're hoping to think about in the future. Joe Street, would you like to speak up?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Richard. It was, I'm really, really happy to see people campaign for this. And one of the things that I was wondering about, as you mentioned towards the end, long-term goals. So how long-term are we thinking? And also, what's the strategy for getting government to work on this? Are we talking lobbying, or are we talking like, grassroots organisation? Where are you going with that?
Okay, that's two sort of good questions there. Clearly, we're talking about major reform. We're talking about primary legislation, so that means a government bill. The government had promised straight after the general election in December 29 to bring forward an employment bill, which didn't have reform of shared parental leave in it. It did have other things in it, like making flexible working the default. That bill didn't appear in the last session, and then, to the surprise of many, including me, it completely disappeared from the Queen's speech that followed the new opening of Parliament. But the government says they still intend to bring it forward, and the sort of silver lining of that delay, because that's what we're looking at least another year before it comes forward now probably, is that gives us time to lobby government and for government to accept the case for including reform of shared parental leave in that bill, and working up some proposals of its own, which obviously we'd like to influence. And I've said, we feel that if you apply those fairly basic principles, on which we think there is considerable sort of consensus amongst organizations working in the field, there aren't many options. There aren't hundreds of different models you could come up with. You can play with the cost by how much you increase the pay rate, and there are some stepping stones. When we first proposed it, we didn't have 6 months of parental leave fully paid. We were trying to work within the sort of existing parameters of there only being 9 months of paid leave available, and so we had 3 months paid and 3 months unpaid. But the longer we thought about it, we thought that giving people, and particularly fathers, unpaid leave is just pointless. We know we know they won't take it. So what's the point? And therefore, if you want to do this properly, it should be 6 months fully paid. But getting to the level of pay we want to get to is clearly a long-term thing. No, as I say, 2.7 billion, 100% increase in the current bill just to bring it up to minimum wage levels, which we know would by itself will not massively increase take up by fathers. We know it's got to go higher still. So we think that's like the sort of the basic minimum that needs to happen, but actually it needs to go much further than that. But my guess is that Mark and I were chatting about this before we started, that is a long-term project spread over years, perhaps a decade or more, and we may not convince this government, we may not convince the government. As well as working on trying to convince this government, we've got to try and convince any future government. So that includes lobbying the Labour Party, which doesn't talk about these issues very much. Ed Miliband has been talking about it a bit in recent weeks, but only in the context of the book he's just published rather than in his official capacity as business secretary. And apart from that, this is not an issue that you hear much on. And of course, those basic price tags are a little bit eye-watering. But the reality is that we won't get anywhere near where we want to be unless we sort of tackle this issue and do it properly.
Thanks, Richard. That's really helpful. There's another way of thinking about it as well, is that presumably it would save business money, and that presenting it to large corporation. The reason I'm asking this is that we're currently trying to improve parental leave pay at my institution, and they're always carping about the cost, which is, well, I think I'd say it's minimal. We're talking like pennies down the back of the sofa, and they're carping about this and presenting a shared parental leave model like this as a, as statutory, as something that the government will pay, would no doubt go down extremely well with the bean counters that we're currently trying to negotiate with. So thank you very much. It's really helpful.
Thanks, Joe. I think we've got Lauren on, and we've got a couple of questions in the chat as well, but we'll go to Lauren first.
Hi there. So I was wondering what you think about organisations at the moment. If we don't want to wait for the government, and we could be waiting forever, what do you propose might be a good model for employers to take up now, bearing in mind that if we were to take up your proposed model, we wouldn't then be able to claim back the statutory shared parental leave contribution, because we wouldn't be then following the government's rules. So what would you think a good employer, what kind of model could they take up in the meantime?
Well, they could, if they had the commitment, they could adopt as an employer our model. I mean, the employers can do whatever they want, really, in terms of enhanced schemes for employees. But obviously, the statutory scheme is still there underneath. So, like John Lewis and Aviva and other places, for example, where the organisation provides 6 months of paid leave to each parent. At Aviva, it's 6 months on full pay. At John Lewis, it's 3 months on full pay and then 3 months at a slightly reduced rate, 50%, I think. The mother's still entitled to take another 6 months of leave beyond that under the statutory scheme, but she will only get the basic £152 per week for any such leave that she takes. So there's our model. There is that straightforward 6+6 model for employers, which, as I say, is it's a fairly elite club. It's growing slowly, and most of the employers in it are very large, profitable businesses, like insurance companies. Whether that's a realistic model for much smaller organizations in the private sector or even for public sector organizations, I don't know. I mean, that's something for unions perhaps to decide, what they want to see, and then seek to negotiate that with employers.
I think it's the age-old challenge, isn't it, to convince the employer on the benefits to it when they're looking at the bottom line, I suppose. Does that help, Lauren? Was there anything else you wanted to follow up on for that?
And Mark, sorry, go on.
It would be great to get a list of those who have followed your model, a list of companies I'd be interested in.
Well, I think I can answer that now and say I'm not aware of any employer that's followed our model, because we're not selling it to employers at the moment. We only came up with this model in 2019, and our focus has been is on the statutory scheme. That's what we want to see reform, because the shape of the statutory scheme does influence what employers do.
Absolutely, it does.
Scheme. And we know, for example, that a big problem at the moment is that many employers who do provide enhanced maternity pay do not provide enhanced shared parental leave pay. Now, and there've been several legal case challenges to that all failed, and there is an argument that because there's no legal requirement on employers to enhance their shared parental leave pay if they provide enhanced maternity pay. And as we understand it, the government did consider introducing such a requirement when it introduced the shared parental leave scheme, but decided not to do so because there was a fear that it could have an adverse effect of leading to sort of low profitability employers. Rather than enhancing shared parental leave pay, they just stopped providing enhanced maternity pay. So people would lose out. And the government can't require employers to provide enhanced schemes. That's something that employers will have to decide to do themselves. And I say that there's a big role for trade unions there, I think.
Richard, did you have a point you wanted to add in there?
I made it.
Yeah, sorry. And we've had a couple of questions from a couple of people asking about encouraging fathers, even if this leave was available, for example. It's more the culture side, I think, encouraging them to take up the leave, and whether what role employers would have. I know you're talking about statutory, but I suppose it does connect to it. Whether you have any thoughts on that?
So that's a really, really good point. In my talk, I focused exclusively on changing the sort of the legal framework for shared parental leave, but it's pretty clear that that's not the whole picture, and that there's little point, in fact, trying to sort of push through reform here if we don't also look at issues like childcare. We need much greater availability of affordable childcare at an earlier age than is currently. We need more flexible working so that both parents can change their working patterns after taking leave in this first period after the birth for the long haul. And we need to change culture in the workplace. And that's about the political leadership and by leadership from the sort of business leaders who need to wake up. And there was, Joe made the point that there are lots of benefits to organizations from having decent provision in this area. They're quite difficult to sort of quantify, but there's ample evidence out there that equal parenting works for parents, but it also works for their employers in terms of retention, productivity, just the general happiness of staff. And those things do have financial benefits. Unfortunately, those benefits would go to employers rather than the government itself. There would be some benefits to government, but most of those financial and economic benefits are accrued by employers, while the government covers the cost of the statutory scheme. That's the nature of these things.
I'll bring in Jeremy at this point, because I imagine he'll be following up on that. But there's also a question about neonatal care that would be good if you could perhaps mention or discuss if that has come into your thinking on the maternity action policy side of things. But I'll bring Jeremy in first, because I imagine it'll be following up on your point.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say with the point about encouraging fathers, I think as Richard has said, it's a bit of there's a bit of chicken and egg here, The evidence from Scandinavia is quite clear that if you put in place a system where fathers, where the pay is, the statutory pay is reimbursed to employers at a decent rate, 70–80% of salary, the fathers will take the leave. So without a system that even in principle recognizes and sort of endorses the importance of active fatherhood, it's hard to see how we're ever going to shift this at all. Do you know what I mean? So I think Richard's right. The sort of a system where where you get the pay up to a kind of basic level would probably help shift the culture a bit. Probably not going to solve the problem though, because at the end of the day, these decisions, with lots of people like to tell the story that you know, fathers not taking leave is about, I don't know, is connected in some way to toxic masculinity and all of that kind of stuff. You know, the men fundamentally don't want it, and they see childcare as women's work and so on. Money talks, you know, and it doesn't just talk to fathers, it talks to mothers too. These decisions are made by families sitting around the kitchen table and working out what they can or can't afford to do based on their real circumstances and where we are at in you know, economic history is that fathers are still much more likely to be the main breadwinner or the only breadwinner. And so what do you do if you're a couple sitting down working out who's going to take time off? That's what it boils down to. So I think we, you know, yes, there is a cultural element to this, but that's as much about making employers see that if they want to hold on to talent, they need to think about the male talent too, in terms of how, you know, how are men who have just become fathers, how are they coping with the juggling of work and home? So some employers see that with mothers because it's like there's an automatic connection in their heads. Oh yeah, in the childbearing years, a bunch of women are going to go off and have babies, and then we need to end up, we don't want to lose them. I would say that probably, you know, the main, if only, benefit of the shared parental leave scheme as it currently is that we now have some exemplars of companies that have kind of used that to start to look at fathers in the same way. And I think we need a lot more of that happening. And we do need men who run businesses or who are in positions of power within organizations to stand up and be counted on this and to demonstrate that they themselves are involved fatherhood and they are going to take the time off. So we need all that to happen, but I think, you know, I think you can't underestimate the power of money in influencing the decision making, is my view.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. I did want to briefly mention, Fire's got a hand up as well, just the neonatal care aspect of it. I don't know if that came into any of your thinking with the current model, or if that's something you're thinking about for the future, Richard.
Not specifically in terms of our model, but the government has already pledged to introduce a period of additional leave for parents whose child is in neonatal care, and that is one of the promised elements of the employment bill, and that we've been waiting for and is now delayed. I said already, ministers keep saying that they still intend to bring it forward, even though it wasn't in the Queen's speech for this session. But only time will tell whether they're genuine in saying that. But should the bill come forward, then there are good provisions in the bill that no doubt we and others will seek to try and improve on as the bill goes through Parliament. But in a sense that a lot of the sort of battle over that issue is won. We just need this bill to come forward. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's already quite a large. Other provisions in it, for example, are to establish a new single enforcement body for some of the workplace rights. So that's bringing together the enforcement of the minimum wage, gang master licensing, and enforcement of employment agencies all under one roof, which is an idea that's been kicking around for a very long time. But that's quite a big undertaking, and the legislation on it will be pretty complex. So we're already looking at quite a sort of large, cumbersome bill. And the government had promised prior to the onset of the pandemic to consult on a number of issues, such as flexible working, which was a pledge in the Conservative manifesto at the general election in December 2019. But talking to officials, they've got absolutely no idea how to do it. So they need to, that is making flexible working the default. It's a very easy thing to say. It's not such an easy thing to legislate for. And it's clear that the government doesn't have an oven-ready flexible working scheme. So they need to devise one. And as far as we can tell, they've not yet done that. So there's a lot of work to be done. Which makes our task of trying to get something like reform of shared parental leave added into the bill that much more difficult. But we do, at least as I say, the silver lining is that with the delay of the bill, we have a bit more time than we originally thought. And we need to use that time. So we need to be talking about this issue now.
Absolutely. I'll bring in Fire quickly, and then also there was a topic around Crystal mentioned mental health as well. I don't know if that kind of connects to extending the leave for fathers and partners as well, and birth mothers, just giving that time, that paid time, I think. But if there is time, we'll maybe have a quick chat about that. But Fire, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Richard, for the presentation. I really like the model that's been developed, and I particularly appreciate the way that it sort of protects a full year of time for the mother and very explicitly acknowledges that there are health and sort of the biological reality of being a birth mother that is going to make the experience of having a child very different for a woman versus a man. But I guess the thing that does sort of worry me in all of this is really, as others have stated, it's the kind of underlying financial and economic mechanisms which sort of underpin people's decisions about taking leave and what can happen. And I see that, the model that you've proposed, which is just so much better and more equitable than what is in place at present, that until both the gender pay gap and the amount of statutory pay are sorted out, I feel like it could almost subvert the better system that you're suggesting. Because on the one hand, as Jeremy was just saying, and I mean, I've said this in other fora previously, that I think, if the man is the breadwinner, or makes more money, it's simply not in a family's financial best interests to let the, the family have that kind of shared leave. It's simply impossible. But you can also imagine a situation where if, the model you're proposing were adopted, but the statutory pay wasn't sorted out, you end up, I think, inadvertently creating a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots, because there will be some families who could take a collective 18 months of terrible pay and still survive it. The majority of families won't. And so in a sense, it's like, until we fix these bigger problems, I guess what I'm trying to do is, I know I'm not trying to sound like overtly negative at the system, because I think it's fantastic. There's so much I love about it. I just worry that in trying to create something better, we're actually also increasing some of the inequalities that we see between families. And that, I guess, is just something to bear in mind. And so with that being said, I'm just wondering what it is that we can do as people who don't necessarily work at the intersection of this kind of policy. We're just families who want our lives to work out, and we don't have the ability to move to a place like Finland, which is apparently where you need to go. They have some of the best educational outcomes in the world, some of the best parental leave in the world, and they also tend to score very high on all of the kind of happiness and contentment scores in Europe. I mean, let's tie it all together, and but since we can't do that, since we can't all up sticks and move to Finland, from where we sit, what is it we can do to kind of help or inspire or force through some of these changes that need to happen so we can get to something that's far more equitable?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Fire. And I mean, Jeremy is done chicken and egg, and he's absolutely right. And I would add to, all these things are connected, and no one thing is the golden bullet. We reform parental leave scheme. That's not going to lead to utopian world of equality. We need to change childcare, which is horrendously sort of challenging and expensive. But we need to do that. We've got to change flexible working practices and cultures. All of that, we've got to narrow the pay gap. But hopefully, if we make progress on all these things, they sort of reinforce each other. I mean, a more equitable parental leave scheme should contribute to reducing the gender pay gap. But it's not going to eradicate it. Even if we paid, 100% wage replacement level of the pay, which is never going to happen in a statutory scheme, not in many, many lifetimes. That's not enough on its own. We've got to do all these things, but we have to try and keep making progress where and when we can, because we can't wait. We can't wait to reform parental leave.
She's Canadian, really cool. Paxton ran an action called Fire Coverick, and she's like really clever. She made like a really good point. I was like, I want to be her, and in the background she's got like a bone candle and stuff, like a candle in a bone. And that would be a friend. So that's the guy from the Fatherhood Institute. That's the guy from Maternity Action. Yeah, Maternity Action.
Francesca, I think you have your mic on. Don't know if you wanted to make a point there, or did you want to mention anything? Oh, no. Sorry for that. Did you want to? Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Richard? I know we're getting towards the end of this this meeting, but I think what I would just add to it is that as colleagues from around the UK HEI sector, what we can be doing, I suppose, and what I think we can be doing is actually having these conversations, really sharing our knowledge, sharing what we're doing. Like I know Fire this last week was sharing a report that she's been doing at Durham University, and others doing similar work, sharing that knowledge, building that collective sense of purpose, and supplementing what Richard and Jeremy are already doing, and kind of building that wider sense of collective vision towards the future, and then speaking to our employers and getting them, like I know my colleague Joe is doing at Northumbria. So actually trying to articulate some of this to employers, and then we can have more case studies of how it's working and building momentum that way. And that personally, that's what I think. I don't know what others think, but that's some of the strategy that I would probably say is a good way forward. Not to dictate. Jeremy, did you have your hand up before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I mean, just to agree with that, I suppose. I think it's so refreshing, like being in this group here, where often when, I don't know if Richard has found this too, but if I get invited to things to talk about all this stuff, a lot of the time, I would say the majority of the time, the questioning begins with negativity about men. And my God, you know, and you just keep, it's like you're banging your head against a brick wall to convince people that the fundamental problem here is not that men don't want time off with their babies. You know, it happened, as I said before, it happened a couple of weeks ago, having briefed the journalists at You and Yours for, I kid you not, an hour and a half about all of this. They then go off and do the interviews, and the presenter takes an incredibly hostile tone to the men being interviewed, basically telling them, well, yeah, but you know, you took time off, but you know, fundamentally men don't want to, do they? As if that's the problem, you know? So it's lovely to be in this kind of space where that is not the narrative, but you know, don't kid yourselves. You live in a world where that is the starting point. Probably among your employers, the people around you and whatever. So I would say on a practical level, one of the things you can do is quietly, consistently, and with passion, chip away at all of that, you know, because that is part of the battle. Even to get the likes of us into the room, you have to have cleared all that out of the way, you know, before we get into the detail of, okay, so what do fathers get, what do mothers get, da, 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 da. And of course, allied to that is the belief, very profound throughout our society, that, you know, fundamentally all of this stuff is women's work, and there you go. Which underpins our current policy and most of the discussions about it. Absolutely.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And Richard, did you have anything you wanted to say before we sign off for today? It's been great. I really, really appreciate it.
No, I don't think so. Just to endorse what Jeremy just said, it's great to have these discussions, and we need to be doing it. And you know, the contribution that we can all make is, if we talk to one other person about it, we started a conversation, and that's really, really important.
And I think this, yeah. Sorry.
For organizing these two sessions and for enabling me to join you. Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome, and hopefully we'll be able to have you both back in the future and continue the conversation and have new guests as well to add more people to this. Just to the people in the room in the network, I'm hoping to try and get someone from a carers perspective potentially. If anyone has any contacts, I've reached out to Carers UK. Not yet had a response, but I'm hoping that they might be an organisation we could speak with as well to kind of include the carers perspective more in the future as well. And I'm speaking with Chris Whitting from Newcastle University, who's their carers lead. So, but apart from that, I just want to thank Richard very much for wonderful presentation and excellent responses to questions. I know there've been some questions that I've not been able to give to Richard. I've taken a note of them, so we might be able to send those to Richard if there's anything we could follow up on. But yeah, thank you very much everyone for contributing, and hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and great to see you all. Thanks very much.
Okay.
I'll let you all drift off. And Richard, if you wanted to have a quick debrief afterwards, so
yeah,
I'm happy just to stay on the line.